New Zealand. First, let me acknowledge that this webinar is organized on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge the elders, families, and descendants who have been custodians of these lands for many generations. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Professor Rafal Pankowski, a co-founder of Poland's leading anti-racist organization, Never Again. The mission of the Never Again Association is to promote multicultural understanding and to contribute to the development of a democratic civil society in Poland and in the broader region of Central and Eastern Europe. Never Again is particularly concerned with the problem of education against racial and ethnic prejudices among the young. We know that nationalism has always been a feature across Europe's political spectrum, but in the recent decade, there has been a significant growth in voter support for right-wing and populist parties. This trend is visible across the globe, including, of course, America, but even in the European Union Parliament. In Poland, the national radical camp claims to be continuing Polish national traditions grounded in the Catholic fundamentalist ideology and attacking ethnic and gender diverse groups or minorities. So what do we know about the growth of the ultra-right in Poland and its support base, and how do we challenge it? I hope that we can learn more about challenging nationalist extremism in Poland from Professor Pankowski, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Sociology, Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, and who published widely on racism, nationalism, populism. Welcome, Professor Pankowski.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for your invitation. I'm really honored and happy to be meeting with friends from Australia, New Zealand, even if virtually. Of course, one of the things that are different in Poland and in Australia, apart from the time zones, is the issue of diversity. And of course, as you know well, Australia is a very diverse, very multicultural society. Poland is not. Today, Poland is one of the most mono-ethnic, monocultural societies in the whole of Europe, which is paradoxical if you look at Polish history as a whole. Because, of course, historically speaking, Poland used to be one of the most diverse countries in the whole of Europe. Today, the situation is very different, of course, as a result of 20th century history, the Holocaust, deportations, waves of immigration, and so on. Today, the percentage of minorities, especially ethnic minorities in Poland, is very small. And actually, as we speak, there is a national population census underway, and it's very interesting to see the results, which probably will confirm the image of Polish society as relatively monocultural, monoethnic. This is not to say that minorities do not exist. Of course, they exist, but the size of the minority populations, minority communities, is very different from what it used to be historically. Of course, I should add that the situation is changing slowly also as a result of migration, especially migration from the Ukraine, which is very important to the Polish labor market today. But even if we can observe the presence of Ukrainian migrants in Poland today, what is changing much slower is the discourse on diversity, or the mentality that that is related to the issue of social diversity. Accepting diversity as a value is, generally speaking, quite rare in Polish society. Although, having said all that, I would argue that a return to diversity for Poland would be a return to normality. But this may be common sense to me and to many of you, I suppose. But this kind of statement would be considered very provocative and controversial in the Polish context today, where, as I said, diversity as a value is very rarely talked about. The subject of our meeting, nationalist extremism, it consists of two terms which are essentially contested terms. And of course, we know that both nationalism and extremism are not clear terms at all. They have many meanings for many different people and in many different contexts. And of course, if we talk about the tradition of nationalism in Poland, it has had different faces, different forms. On the one hand, we have this tradition of what we may call civic nationalism, which can be symbolized, for example, by the figure of Józef Piłsudski, which we normally wouldn't even call nationalism if we speak in Polish. Most people would simply refer to it as patriotism. This tradition is not without problems vis-a-vis authoritarianism, for example, but by and large, it is not a tradition of exclusion. There is another tradition which is much closer to the exclusionary form of ethno-nationalism, which is, of course, represented by the rival of Józef Piłsudski, that is Roman Dmowski, the founder of the so-called national democratic movement in the first decades of the 20th century. And this ethno-nationalistic tradition is in turn very strongly linked with Roman Catholic identity. And I would say in this context, the religious element of the identity is an identity marker more than anything else. It has much more to do with the communal belonging than this or that aspect of religious beliefs. And I would say that the ethno-nationalist understanding of national identity is pretty hegemonic in Poland today. So the perception of Polishness as an ethnic and religious concept is predominant. And I don't think it is representative of this long history of Polish multiculturalism and diversity, but it is a fact. It is a fact that we live with, and that has a lot of repercussions in the field of Polish politics, but more broadly in the field of Polish culture, Polish society as such. The other term, also very problematic, extremism. Of course, it's a relative term, and the meaning seems to depend a lot on what we think is the mainstream. And extremism might be defined or perceived in opposition to the social political mainstream. And in the Polish context, especially today, it is more and more difficult to see what the difference is between so-called extremism and so-called mainstream. I would say the demarcation line is increasingly blurred, and the more I study it, the more confused I am about who is an extremist and who is in the mainstream, and I can provide more examples of that. But the situation today, where we are dealing with a very acute crisis of democratic values, where we see the discourse of nationalist extremism sort of, infiltrating mainstream discourses, it did not happen overnight. It's been a process that took years and decades. And if we think back to the 1990s, the early period of the democratic transformation of Poland, Poland was actually held up many times as a model country, as a model of successful democratic transformation, and a country without nationalist extremism, or at least without significant extreme right or extreme nationalist movements, which was never quite correct, I would argue, because those groups existed, but they were relatively disunited. They were relatively marginal, or at least when it comes to their impact on the political mainstream. By and large, they were not represented on the level of parliamentary representation, but they existed. Gradually, they managed over the years to build a certain base, a social base, but I think importantly, it's also a cultural base. And I would say the sort of political or parliamentary representation of the movement is just the last bit of a much longer and broader process that happened since the 1990s. And I think even if some representatives of the political mainstream or media mainstream back in the 90s admitted that there is something like nationalist extremism in Poland, there was a very widespread assumption, both spoken and unspoken, that it's basically a problem of the older generation. The generations, the people who belong to the generation who may have been socialized in the 1930s, before World War II, they may have some, prejudices, for example, anti-Semitic prejudices going back to that time, but sooner or later, that generation will disappear naturally, and the younger people who are born and raised in a democratic society would automatically be more tolerant, more open-minded, more progressive than the generation of their parents and grandparents. And as I said, I think this assumption was very widespread on the part of what we may call the liberal elites of Poland. And I'm not blaming anybody for having that assumption back then, but already in the 1990s, when we created the Never Again Association, we questioned this very widespread assumption, because we pointed to some phenomena that were maybe not noticed in the mainstream media or mainstream politics, but they were happening already on the level of youth culture, on the level of football culture, for example, on the level of the racist rock music scene. Soon later, the internet became a very important and popular tool for spreading radical nationalist and racist ideologies. So in the end, what happened, and we see the results today, is something else. It is the opposite to the expected result. Namely, we can talk about a transmission of radical nationalist ideology to the younger generation through those different channels I mentioned, and of course I could list even more. But if we look at sociological data from the last decade or so, there are some really surprising or not surprising results showing that the younger people, the people who are born and raised in a democratic society, are in fact not automatically more open-minded than their parents or grandparents, but in many cases they are actually more prone to intolerance, to radical nationalist ideas and ideologies than their parents and grandparents. So it's a paradoxical situation, which I think very much, goes against the gist of what we can call transformation science that was so popular in the 1990s and beyond. And I think some of the foundations of this paradigm of democratic transformation are very much questionable today. They need to be critically revised because the reality disproves them. So throughout this process of gradual build-up of the social cultural base of the far right in Poland, there have been some watershed moments, and I think maybe different people would identify those watershed moments differently, but you could say one of them was the year 2001, when two radical nationalist parties entered the parliament for the first time. There was a brief moment in 2005, 2007, where those two parties were in a government coalition. Another moment was 2010. So the Smolensk plane crash, when the then president of Poland, Lech Kaczyński, and many other political leaders were killed tragically in a plane accident, which gave rise to a big conspiracy theory industry that became politically significant in the next years. But I would say, in my view, the most crucial watershed moment was the year 2015. Or to be more specific, the summer of 2015. So I'm not even talking about the parliamentary election or the presidential election that both took place that year with important repercussions. But I'm talking about the European refugee crisis in the south of Europe, so not even in Poland. And as we know, the European refugee crisis at that time didn't really affect Poland directly in any way, because very few of those refugees went to Poland or intended to settle in Poland. But the way the crisis was portrayed in Polish media and in political discourse was very negative, and I believe it activated a lot of what you could call dormant prejudices that existed, but they were really amplified through this highly negative discourse, those highly negative frames of the discourse. And the situation coincided with the parliamentary electoral campaign, when we witnessed different right-wing and far-right parties and groups competing with each other on who would be more anti-refugee, anti-migration, anti-Muslim, and nationalist. And what resulted was the hardening, the radicalization of the whole of the right-wing spectrum. And I always knew as an academic, but also as a practitioner, that levels of hate speech and hate crime are correlated. But I think in the summer of 2015, we really saw for the first time, I saw for the first time, they can be correlated so directly, so tightly, so that the level of hostility, the level of hate speech expressed in public, immediately was translated into physical attacks on different minorities, even if those minorities are so small in Poland today. In some cases, we documented cases of attacks based on mistaken identity. So, for example, a group of Italian tourists was attacked because they were mistaken for Arabs or Muslims or people from the Middle East because of their slightly darker skin complexion. So some of those cases were really absurd, but they resulted directly from the negativity, the negative discourse, the hostile discourse and hate speech related to the European refugee crisis. And I think since then we have seen this sort of heightened level of hostility against different types of otherness, so different types of difference in society, not just the refugees or Muslims. There are few of them in Poland. The Muslim community is probably around 20,000 people in a country of 38 million, so it's a tiny group. But we can definitely talk about the phenomenon known as Islamophobia without Muslims, which of course is parallel to a much older phenomenon in Poland known as anti-Semitism without Jews, which I believe is a term coined in the early 70s by Paul Lendwey, writing about Poland and other countries in Central Europe. So the Jewish community today is also small. It may be 10, it may be 20,000 people in a country of about 38 million. But also for the Jews, the levels of hostility are relatively high, certainly out of all proportion to the actual size of this community in Poland today. Now, I think there was a moment soon after 2015 when some commentators, analysts claimed that Islamophobia had now replaced anti-Semitism as the main form of hatred in the Polish context. And I was never quite sure about it, to be honest. I thought, well, anti-Semitism would not disappear so easily, or would not be replaced that easily. I thought maybe it's more correct to say Islamophobia supplemented anti-Semitism as a major form of hatred in political discourse and in media discourses. And unfortunately, I was proved right in 2018. And I think many of you heard about this controversial piece of legislation, the so-called Law on the National Memory Institute, which criminalized some types of speech related to the Holocaust and the complicity in the Holocaust of Poles. Now, what I think was even worse than this problematic piece of legislation was the kind of, again, the kind of discourse that went with it in mainstream media and mainstream politics. Of course, it's nothing new for nationalist far-right extremists to use anti-Semitism. But I think it was for the first time in many years, certainly the first time since 1968, where this kind of open hostility against Jews was represented so openly especially in state-controlled media and by politicians, including especially politicians from the ruling party. And I think repercussions of those weeks and months in 2018 are still present, and they come back. For example, it came back during the presidential campaign last year, when the issue of the so-called Jewish claims was again manipulated out of all proportion to the actual topic by the state-controlled media, and it played a role in the re-election of the sitting president. But also this year, again, there is a controversy around the so-called Jewish claims, which is very much exploited by the ruling party and the media controlled by the ruling party. But there is a third group that has also suffered very nasty attacks from the ruling party and its media. It is the LGBT community. And I would say that all those three groups, or those three minority groups, minority communities, the Muslims / refugees, the Jews, and the LGBT community, they rotate as targets of negative speech, as well as different forms of discrimination or even physical attacks. And I think over those last years, anti-minority mobilization became one of the main tools of running the country, one of the main tools of political mobilization on the part of the ruling party. There is enough. The extreme right to the right of the ruling party still exists, and it is actually relatively strong. But sometimes it's virtually impossible to distinguish the arguments, the statements of the extreme right and the ruling party today. Like I said, the extreme right is now represented in parliament again, in the form of confederacja, so confederation, which includes some far-right nationalist extremist groups, which you might even call neo-fascist. Currently, confederacja has 11 members of parliament. So it's not a big group, but I would say their visibility and their impact on the broader political spectrum is actually quite significant, and I believe they push the frames of Polish politics even more towards the sort of nationalist extremist vision, which I described. Now I think it would be correct to say something about the very important part of the context of the last year or two, namely the COVID pandemic. And I think Confederacja, the far right, has actually exploited the pandemic situation very effectively, spreading conspiracy theories around the pandemic itself, but also around vaccinations. And they also had a big impact in terms of more or less stopping the vaccination process in Poland today. I think it's less than 50% of society that actually got the vaccination, and the rest are no longer interested. Basically, quite clearly under the influence of those conspiracy theories, which are promoted especially by several leaders and groups within Confederacja, within the extreme right party. They have been very effective in promoting those theories online, especially on YouTube. And I think YouTube as a company has a lot to answer for in terms of enabling this spread of conspiracy theory, which in this case has a direct impact on public health. So I think it's one of those cases when we can actually illustrate how far-right propaganda has a really dangerous impact on society in a very direct way. Now, from what you heard from me already, you might understand I'm not terribly optimistic about the near future of Polish democracy and democratic values in Poland. And of course, I only focused on some aspects of the crisis of democracy in Poland as I see it. There are many other dimensions, such as the rule of law, the Polish position vis-a-vis the European Union, etc. But we can go back to it if you wish. But let me tell you something maybe just a little bit more optimistic by the end. And I always try to think of something optimistic, not to give a very depressing depressing impression. What I think is actually optimistic in Poland today is that in the sort of polarized context of Polish society today, there are actually civil society groups that are challenging nationalist extremism, which is definitely on the rise, and it has some big pockets of influence among the young generation, as I said, especially young men. There is also an important gender dimension to the phenomenon, but there are civil society groups also among Polish youth, but not only, that openly challenge those nationalist extremist tendencies. And of course, the Never Again Association belongs to this category. And thank you for the for introducing the mission of Never Again in the beginning of our meeting. Again, I would say that because the scale of the problem grew, the scale of the challenge grew for us over the years too. When we started in the 1990s, the problem existed, but it grew over the years. But of course, it doesn't mean that we should give up. On the contrary, we believe we should also do more in order to challenge it. And I can list a lot of different activities that we have conducted over the years. But I think one important, I would say, one important activity that belongs to the core of our mission is the Brown Book, which is a register of hate crimes and the most extreme hate speech incidents which took place in Poland over the last decades. The Brown Book was initiated by Marcin Kornak, who was the founder and leader of the Never Again Association for many years. Marcin Kornak passed away in 2014, but we continue what he started, and we believe it is important to continue with documentation with this kind of documentation because it turns out to be much more reliable and comprehensive than any statistics provided by institutions. And it is a tool of raising awareness also on the part of public opinion. Last year, in May 2020, we published a report under the title "The Virus of Hatred," which focused on hate crime and hate speech cases related to the pandemic, and that was quite early on in the pandemic period. But we already then identified some of the patterns of hatred related to the coronavirus, including the first wave of hate speech and hate crimes against the Asian community in Poland. That also affected some of my students at Collegium Civitas, so I also heard some first-hand accounts of the impact it had on Asian students in Warsaw. But apart from monitoring and publishing those results, we also have educational activities. And when I say educational, I mostly mean non-formal education, because we think what is happening in the system is important, but it's also important what is happening outside of the system of formal education. And I think we understand it better and better today, where the system of formal education is very much under political pressure from the far right. I would say with the current minister who speaks, who says things which would be unbelievable from a minister even just a few years ago. What he says about minorities, about women, and basically the system of formal education, including higher education, is in a very difficult situation because of the current political ideological pressure. So informal education, I believe, becomes ever more important, and what we do is also using popular culture in a positive way. So one of our big campaigns is Music Against Racism, which includes records and festivals and gigs with a variety of styles, and many friends in the music community are very supportive and very much involved in this campaign. A second campaign, which is maybe more difficult but also important, is under the motto "Let's kick racism out of the stadiums," and the aim is to challenge the presence of far-right influence in the football culture and subculture, and also promote football as a positive platform for communication, above barriers of race or religion. And I can probably go on and on talking about different activities of the Never Again Association. It is probably time for me to stop now. I'm very interested in your comments and questions, and if there is something else that you would like me to elaborate, please just tell me. But thank you again for your invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much. That has been an amazing and really detailed account of what has been happening, in Poland in terms of the growth of the nationalism and extremism. So I invite everyone to ask questions. We've got 20 minutes at least to have a discussion. So I am not able to see everyone's cameras, on my screen. So you can raise a hand. Adam is first, There is a tiny reaction icon with at the bottom of your screen, so you can use it, or just unmute yourselves. So Adam first, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Pankowski, for this most interesting and exceptionally well delivered presentation on these worrisome trends in Poland. And I've got a question about a very important institution in the Polish life, the Polish Catholic Church. And I would like to ask you a question. What role, in your view, does the Catholic Church of Poland play in the rise of nationalistic, xenophobic tendencies in Poland? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very important part of the Polish situation. Shall I answer straight away, or shall we collect more comments, as you like?
I think let's go one by one, and because I'm sure the other questions will be probably a little bit different.
As I mentioned very briefly in the beginning, this sort of hegemonic idea, it exists. The sort of assumption that, or the stereotype, is probably a better way to put it, that every Pole must be a Catholic. It is very much present, although of course it's just not true, both historically and in contemporary times. But the influence of the Catholic Church is very strong, especially political influence. And the Church's influence vis-a-vis the current ruling party is very important. But again, of course, Catholicism means different things to different people, including in Poland. I think in the 1990s we could still debate, who is more representative of the Church as such. Is it Radio Maria, or is it Tygodnik Powszechny? Radio Maria is much more than a radio station. It is a whole social movement with their own university, their own daily paper, and the whole array of different front organizations, which is very politically significant, very significant politically, and it is also very strongly influenced by radical nationalism and anti-Semitism in particular. Tygodnik Powszechny is, let's say, the opposite of that. It is a liberal, progressive Catholic weekly magazine that has existed for many decades already, and it is also very well known. So, like I said, in the 90s, we could still debate, who is more representative of the Catholic Church as such. And I think, unfortunately, today, this kind of debate does not really make much sense anymore, because it is quite clear that Radio Maria won, the competition for influence within the Polish Church. And I emphasize Polish Church because it's interesting and maybe surprising to note that one of the most unpopular figure, or I should say hated figures, for many Polish Catholics today, including clergymen, is the current Pope, Pope Francis. Actually, there was a case in one of the churches in Poland. They prayed for the death of Pope Francis, which is quite something for a Catholic church, and it's an extreme example. But the kind of hostility against the Pope is very widespread in the Polish church, and it is very much directed to some of the issues we already talked about, especially the refugee issue. So I would say this tendency in the long run probably leads to a crisis of the moral authority of the church in Poland.
Alex,
but it also is important as a form of legitimizing the kind of right-wing nationalist that dominates the Polish political mainstream today. So that would be my short answer to a very important and complex question, but I hope I conveyed some of the bits of the situation through this answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got Francie next. I think Matthew was also in the line. I'm not sure, Matthew, if you're still interested in asking a question.
No, I had the same question as Adam, so
okay, cool.
Put my hand down.
So then will be Karin and Wojciech Zagała.
Thank you very much, Gosia, and thank you very much, Professor Pankowski. It was very interesting, very grim as well, I have to say. And my question has to do with, you gave a picture which seems to suggest, and I don't know enough, of course, about the context of contemporary Poland, but that there are virtually no channels of counter discourse, whether an independent media, the press, or even the lack of effectiveness online. That is not specific to Poland. I think the far-right movement seems to have found a very, very comfortable element with the online virtual world. The internet works particularly well for these groups, but there is nothing that, in theory, would prevent a counter discourse to emerge. So how do you explain this lack of counter voice? You gave us a good history and the whole reasons, but surely some groups, and I have colleagues and friends in Poland, I've been there a few times, are saddened, embarrassed, angry, a lot of strong emotion as the current status of their country. So where is the press? Where is the counter discourse? What's happening there? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think what you said is very important when you mentioned, of course, some of those challenges are not just Polish challenges. Yes, a lot of those problems are global problems, such as the use and abuse of social media by far-right extremists. That is very clear. In this context, I should mention two research projects in which we are participating. One is called Get the Trolls Out, and the other one is called Open Code for Hate Speech, for Hate-Free Communication. Both of these projects are international projects which allow us to compare the situation and especially the responsiveness of social media companies to some of the hateful expressions on their platforms. And I think it is very interesting because we see that the responsiveness is actually much better in English, for example, when it's about contents in English, and it's much slower and much less effective in the context of Polish language contents. So we are focusing our attention now on persuading or lobbying those companies to take the issue more seriously in the Polish context too, which is easier said than done, but we devote a lot of energy, especially this year, to those issues. And now the second element of your comment. Well, I do realize some of what I said sounds grim, and I realize that, but it wasn't exactly my intention to depress you completely. I maybe just did not emphasize the more positive aspects of the Polish picture. This counter discourse actually exists in Poland, and I would stress this is one really important part of the situation. So it's not just it's not just a one-sided picture I wanted to present. Polish society is polarized, which means the ruling party is genuinely popular. Even the more extreme far right is quite popular among some groups, but also opponents of those tendencies have a strong and powerful voice, and especially in independent media. State-controlled media are something else. State-controlled media are completely in the hands of the ruling party, and the propaganda is, in my view, is actually worse than the propaganda of the state-controlled media in the 80s. It can be more manipulative or more aggressive. But independent media still exist in Poland, both press, like Gazeta Wyborcza, and other papers, as well as television. And now one of the main topics of political controversy in Poland, just these days, is the attempt by the ruling party to get rid of TVN, which is the main independent TV station, which is actually owned by Discovery, a US company, and it is one of the main voices of independent journalism, critical of the government, as well as investigating and exposing some of the scandals related to the extreme right and the neo-fascist movement in Poland. So yes, independent media have been under pressure, but they still exist, and I think that's positive. So those channels for counter discourse still exist, and I think that's important to note too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next question from Karin, please.
Thank you very much. I am connected from Leipzig, Germany, and in my research, I deal with nationalist expressions in popular culture, popular history, and so on. And I'm interested in the impact neo-pagan communities have on the far-right scene. And you mentioned the role of the Catholic Church, and in general, the neo-pagan movement is regarded as a marginal movement, but it certainly had some really radical tendencies in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and then they obviously turned their activities more into cultural forms or cultural expressions, and so they are not so much on the classical political scene of activism. So I would like to know how you would estimate the influence of them. Thanks.
Thank you for these questions. For this question, like you said, the neo-pagan movement is not a major factor in Poland, but it just happens to be one of the topics of my own particular interest. So I find this question really interesting. Of course, given the sort of historical role of the Catholic Church in Poland over the centuries, and also recently as a sort of platform for resistance or a shield of resistance during the communist period, as it was rightly pointed out in the chat. Of course, there is not a lot of discursive space for the neo-pagans, but they exist. They appeared in Poland, well, at least in the sort of radical nationalist form in the 1930s. Zadruga was the name of the group, which was a kind of totalitarian pagan group that was both anti-Semitic and anti-Christian. And like you said, it was resurrected. The movement was resurrected in certain forms in the 90s. Also, some cultural forms. It had an impact on the extreme music scene in Poland. So parts of the National Socialist black metal scene. And now we are really talking about the fringes of the subculture. Yes, but they exist. What I find interesting, for example, is the fact that those groups participate in the annual march on the 11th of November in Warsaw, the Independence Day March, organized by the, well, supposedly Catholic nationalist groups. You might think if one group wants to be fundamentalist Catholic and the other group wants to be neo-pagan, they should clash. But they actually happily march side by side on this one day, which I think in a way confirms something I believe in strongly. Those groups, for those groups, religious beliefs are just elements of identity construction, or religion here is an accessory. What is really central is the nationalism and racism in this case. This is why they can cooperate and participate in joint events and initiatives, despite this supposed fundamental difference on the level of religious affiliation. But like I said, it's an interesting topic to me. If you like, we can connect directly. I would be more than happy to send you some more materials on this on this phenomenon. And before I forget, may I just mention I put the address of the Never Again Association Facebook page in the chat. So I would encourage everybody who wishes to learn just a little bit more about the Polish situation and also the activities of Never Again. You are very welcome.
Oops, I think the connection problems. Hopefully it will come through again quite soon. But Karin, thank you for your question. I hope Rafal will come back quite soon, and feel free to contact him directly in regards to your research as well. Wojciech, you will be next, hopefully. Let's see if we can re-establish the connection with Rafal. He is possibly going to try to reconnect Brad. So if you see Rafal Pankowski in the
he's still
request,
he's still in the Zoom, Gosha.
He's still in the Zoom. Okay. Maybe we can just send him a message. One state we've been waiting. So Wojciech has the next question, please.
Well, thank you for your presentation and answers to questions. I've got a question, you know, which is more general. You know, trying to reach to you as a sociologist, reflecting on the state of affairs. You know, among our friends, we often the question whether Polish is a sick society comes up. And and I just wonder, you know, if this is the case, what gives the fuel to this outrage, to extreme feelings? And of course, among the candidates comes the Holocaust and suppressed knowledge about the Holocaust and participation of our society in the Holocaust. There were deportations on the eastern part, southeastern part of Poland of Polish citizens into Soviet Union, and of course, Akcja Wisła. There was but apart from this sort of a suppressed evil, of which layers we can find in our recent history, there is also a sense of humiliation, right? Which definitely, in my, as much as I know, was driving the rise of Nazism in Germany. And I think that the migration from villages to the cities also resulted in quite a wave of aggression in the cities. I remember it in Warsaw from late 50s, early 60s. And in that context, this 1 million and more of Poles that traveled to Western Europe, one would have thought that they learn about inclusiveness, about diversity, but maybe working in sausage factories and as the lowest laborers, they came back with a sense of humiliation again, sort of raising this bar of suppressed anger. So that's my question, whether you've got any thoughts about that.
Well, thank you so much for bringing up such important and difficult issues to the conversation. I think I certainly do agree with you. Many of those historical traumas are still in a way impacting the reality today. They have not been dealt with enough. And I think this is one of the reasons why the controversy about the history law in 2018 was so huge, because it seems such a sensitive issue for many different reasons and on many levels. But Poland is probably one of the few countries anywhere, you know, where history makes front page news regularly. In most other countries I know, it would be on page 10 if reported. In Poland, it's actually one of the main, you know, sort of history is one of the main battlefields, and one of the main you know, elements of contemporary politics. And of course, it's not accidental that the ruling party made polityka historyczna, the policy of history, or the politics of history, one of their main issues, or one of their main fields of activity, with huge amounts of public funding invested into, you know, museums and a lot of other monuments and a lot of other initiatives presenting this very one-sided heroic view of Polish history. And I think I agree with you. This is very much related to those unprocessed historical traumas over decades or even centuries. But one other thing you mentioned is also my particular interest. It is the diversity of experiences of Polish migrants in the West, and especially in the recent years. For example, in the UK, as we know, the Polish community, you know, over the last decade or so, or maybe 2 decades, it grew to about 1 million people. So it's a big group, and like you said, we might think, you know, they had the experience of living in an open society, in a diverse multicultural society that would have a positive impact on their on their general outlook and their attitudes vis-a-vis social diversity. It is not always the case. And one of the sort of interesting, if paradoxical, phenomena in the last years is the activity and the presence of the Polish nationalist far right in the UK among the migrants, the Polish migrants. So those groups that are now known as Konfederacja, they have been active in the UK for the last years. So it's paradoxically the groups that are violently anti-migrant in Poland, at the same time being active among the Polish migrant communities abroad, which is part of the sort of more general phenomenon of internationalization of nationalism. One other example of this phenomenon is the participation of foreign nationalists in the march in Warsaw on the 11th of November, which I already mentioned when we talked about the neo-pagans. This is a very big event. It started as a small event around 2009, 2010, with just a few hundred young men marching with nationalist slogans. And over the years, it grew, and by now it became the biggest far-right event anywhere, not just in Poland, but internationally. Which has been attracting, racist and fascist groups from all over Europe and beyond. And many of those groups are very different, or they may be in conflict with each other. Let's say Slovak and Hungarian nationalists, but they managed to come to Warsaw on this one day and participate in one event, which I think is a really interesting illustration of the globalization and internationalization of the phenomenon of right-wing extremism. But thank you again for your comments.
Thank you so much. And next question from Alexandra. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you for your effort and participation. I am interested in development or emergence of elite education in Poland. And also I see the elite schools, particularly secondary elite schools, as representing to some degree different political and social outlooks of the elites that select those schools. Do you see any possibility that elite schools might actually counteract this development of extreme nationalism, or are some of those schools actually actively promoting those trends, particularly those schools who may be connected to some movements like point of view of Opus Dei or Ordo Iuris and such organizations supporting those schools. And what I worry about, that with the negative reputation of public schools in Poland, some of those private schools or independent schools might actually attract different populations of influential elites, either political, cultural, or social. So basically, I would like to hear maybe your view on that. I know that schools and private schools are very insignificant still number-wise, but they might be influential in promoting some communities that have influence.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, as I mentioned, the educational system as a whole is now very much under pressure, direct pressure, which is rooted in far-right ideology. And I think that applies to all the levels of the system and all the elements of the system. So now it is just one ministry, the Ministry of Education and Higher Education. I know more about higher education from my direct experience, but I think that the pressure is there at every level. Of course, there are also some independent schools and independent institutions of higher education, which, let's say schools created by parents and so on, and so-called social schools. I went to a social lycée. I mean, it's very difficult to translate it into English, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
So some of those schools have a different spirit, definitely. But they in one way or another, they are also part of the formal system, which at the end of the day is controlled by the ministry. So they may be less directly prone to this kind of pressure, or they may be more resistant to this kind of ideological pressure, but the pressure is still there in many different ways, in terms of funding, in terms of recognition of qualifications, and so on and so on. So I think there is a real danger of the Polish educational system becoming like the state-controlled media, becoming a tool of very one-sided, crude propaganda, rooted in nationalist ideology. I very much fear about the near future of the Polish educational system. But of course, as we know, historically, we know it well that this kind of crude propaganda sometimes backfires on those who try to employ it, and we know it backfired in the 80s, and it will probably backfire again. But the cost of ruining the Polish education would still be very high, and I think it's not just my own perception. I think it is the perception of many others who are dealing or who are part of the educational system in one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we will need to conclude very soon. Thank you for covering such a broad spectrum of linked issues. So that was very, very interesting, and obviously all the comments in the chat confirm and add some thoughts. So thank you so much for making time and presenting for us today. As you can see, there is a really deep interest in Australia and New Zealand on what is currently happening, and really deep interest in socio-political effects as well, not only within Poland, but also, globally of those trends, worrying trends. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending today, for wherever you are at the moment. We had guests from clearly Europe and Australasia, so thank you so much. And let's maybe give a round of applause for this presentation. That will be me only on the microphone, but thank you so much. And we wish you and your association all the best in continuing your amazing work. Thank you for posting the Facebook link. I can see that people have acknowledged that and will be definitely accessing through. So, and we will be paying close attention. And if there is anything you need from organizations like ours in Australia, please feel free to contact us, and we will, of course, use our networks to support your activities.
Thank you very much. Once again, it's been a real honor for me to meet with you. Thank you so much for all the comments. If I can be useful in future, please let me know.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.